Hey Scorpio, hope you're doing well. This is going to be a reading for Scorpio Sun, Moon, Rising, Venus, and North Node. Please take what resonates and leave the rest. Before we begin, thank you guys for all the love, the support, the comments, and the positive energy you've been sending this channel. It truly means a lot. All right, let's get into this because there's something very interesting happening here. The energy feels deep. It feels emotional. And honestly, it feels like someone is trying very hard to keep their feelings under control, but it's becoming more difficult than they expected. The more I sit with this energy, the more it feels like this person keeps circling back to you in their thoughts. No matter how much they try to distract themselves, something keeps pulling them back toward this connection. Okay, Scorpio, let's see what's really going on here. The first thing that's catching my attention is the moon. And honestly, this feels like somebody who has been carrying far more emotion than they've allowed anyone to see. I don't even feel like the people closest to them truly know what's happening inside their heart right now. There's something very private about this energy, very hidden, very difficult to put into words. It's almost like this person keeps telling themselves they're fine. They keep trying to move through their day as if everything is normal. They focus on work. They focus on responsibilities. They focus on whatever is directly in front of them. But somehow your energy keeps finding its way back into their mind. You know what this feels like? It feels like somebody who keeps reaching for their phone without realizing it. Somebody who sees something during the day and immediately thinks about you. Somebody who hears a song, drives past a familiar place, or experiences a random moment that somehow reminds them of you. And every time it happens, they try to push it away. But it keeps coming back. The moon is sitting here, almost like a secret they can no longer completely hide from themselves. Okay, and now I'm seeing the Page of Swords. This is interesting, because I don't feel like this person is completely disconnected from you at all. Honestly, I feel like they're paying much closer attention than you realize. For some of you, they may check your social media. For others, they may ask questions indirectly. For some, they simply replay old conversations over and over inside their mind. Whatever the situation is, there is observation happening here. Quiet observation, the kind that nobody talks about, the kind that happens behind closed doors. The strange thing is that the more they watch you, the more confused they become about their own feelings. Because I think there was a point where they genuinely believed they could move on. They thought enough time would pass. They thought enough distance would solve everything. But that isn't exactly what happened. Instead, every little thing seems to be reminding them why this connection affected them so deeply in the first place. And honestly, Scorpio, I keep getting the feeling that they're frustrated with themselves because of it. They don't want to feel this vulnerable. They don't want to feel this exposed emotionally. Yet here they are, still thinking about you, still wondering about you, still trying to understand why your presence has stayed with them for so long. And now the High Priestess is showing herself. Wow, there is definitely something happening beneath the surface. This feels bigger than what is visible right now. I almost feel like there are conversations taking place that you know nothing about, thoughts being processed, decisions being considered, emotions being examined. It's like somebody is sitting alone with their own truth for the first time in a very long time. And what they're discovering isn't necessarily comfortable, because I think they're beginning to realize that what they feel for you never completely disappeared. Maybe they buried it. Maybe they ignored it. Maybe they convinced themselves they had moved beyond it. But something keeps resurfacing. Something keeps returning. You know, intuition can be a funny thing. You can ignore it. You can argue with it. You can run from it. But sometimes it keeps showing up anyway. And that's exactly what this energy feels like. This person keeps getting pulled back toward thoughts of you, back toward memories, back toward questions they never fully answered, back toward emotions they never completely resolved. And honestly, I don't think they expected that. The deeper I go into this energy, the more it feels like they're standing at a crossroads inside themselves. Part of them wants to stay safe. Part of them wants to remain guarded. Part of them wants to keep pretending none of this matters. But another part of them is getting tired of carrying the weight of everything they haven't said. Then we have the Four of Wands. And the moment this card appeared, the atmosphere shifted. Because underneath all the confusion, all the overthinking, all the emotional walls, there seems to be something incredibly simple. peace. When this person thinks about you, they don't just think about attraction. They don't just think about chemistry. They think about comfort. They think about feeling understood. They think about feeling accepted. It's almost like your energy represents a version of life that feels calmer than the one they're currently living. And I think that realization is beginning to hit them much harder than before. They're starting to compare, starting to reflect, starting to recognize what felt genuine, what felt safe, what felt real. The interesting thing is that I don't feel like they're fully ready to reveal all of this yet. Not completely. There's still hesitation here. There's still uncertainty. There's still a lot happening behind the scenes that hasn't reached the surface. But something is changing. Slowly. Quietly. Almost invisibly. And as these cards sit in front of me, I can't shake the feeling that this person is getting closer to a truth they've been avoiding for a very long time. Because the more they try not to think about you, the more they seem to realize that you're already occupying far more space in their heart than they ever intended. And what happens when somebody finally stops running from a feeling they've been carrying for this long? Well, that's where the story starts becoming very interesting. That's where the story starts becoming very interesting. Because what I'm seeing now doesn't feel like avoidance anymore. It feels like reflection. Deep reflection. The kind that happens when the noise finally dies down and a person is left alone with their thoughts. And the first card that is pulling my attention here is the Six of Cups. This energy feels incredibly personal. Not dramatic, not loud, just personal. It's like somebody keeps finding themselves revisiting moments they thought they had already moved beyond. Old conversations, old memories, little details that shouldn't matter anymore but somehow still do. The strange thing is that these memories don't seem forced. They're showing up naturally, almost unexpectedly. This person could be driving somewhere, working, trying to focus on something completely unrelated, and suddenly a memory of you surfaces. A laugh, a look, a conversation, a moment that felt insignificant at the time, and they just sit there with it. Because for some reason, these memories feel different now, more valuable, more meaningful, almost like they're seeing them through a completely different lens. You know, sometimes people don't recognize what something means to them until they no longer have constant access to it. And honestly, that's exactly what this feels like. There is a growing awareness here, an understanding that wasn't fully present before. Because when you were there, they may have assumed you would always be there. When communication was available, they may have assumed it could happen any time. When your energy felt close, they didn't have to truly confront how much it meant to them. But distance has a way of changing perspective. And now I'm seeing the Hermit. Wow. This person feels quieter than before, more withdrawn, more thoughtful, almost like they've stepped away from certain distractions. I don't necessarily feel isolation. I feel contemplation. They're asking themselves questions they avoided for a long time. Questions that don't have easy answers. Questions about choices. Questions about fear. Questions about why they responded the way they did. And honestly, I keep hearing the phrase, "What was I so afraid of?" Because fear seems to be at the center of everything. Not lack of feeling, not lack of attraction, not lack of connection. Fear. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of rejection. Fear of change. Fear of getting hurt. Fear of losing control. And the more they sit with themselves, the harder it becomes to ignore that truth. Because something is happening here. The stories they've told themselves are starting to crack. The explanations they've relied on don't seem as convincing anymore. And now we have the Nine of Swords. Okay, this energy is heavy. Not in a scary way, in a human way. Because I feel like somebody has been losing sleep over things they never properly addressed. Their mind keeps replaying situations, replaying conversations, replaying decisions. And sometimes they're not even thinking about what happened. They're thinking about what didn't happen, the words they didn't say, the chances they didn't take, the emotions they didn't express, the moments they let pass because they thought there would always be another opportunity. Honestly, this feels like somebody who is realizing that time doesn't always wait for people to get comfortable. And that's creating pressure, internal pressure. Because every answer they find seems to lead back to the same place, back to you, back to this connection, back to what they've been trying not to acknowledge. For some of you, this person may even be wondering what you're thinking now, whether you've changed, whether you've moved on. whether you're still carrying any part of this connection yourself. And that uncertainty is becoming difficult for them, because they no longer feel as certain about the future as they once did. And now the Queen of Pentacles is appearing. The moment this card showed up, everything softened, because what they're recognizing isn't only what they lost, it's what they had. There's a difference. One creates sadness, the other creates appreciation. And this feels like appreciation. They're beginning to see your value in ways they may not have fully understood before. Not because you've changed, not because you've become somebody different, but because their perspective is changing. They're seeing your consistency, your patience, your strength, the way you carried yourself, the way you continued moving forward, the way you didn't force anything, the way you simply showed up as yourself. And honestly, I think that realization is humbling them, because there were moments when fear spoke louder than truth, moments when insecurity spoke louder than trust, moments when doubt spoke louder than intuition. And now they're looking back at those moments differently, not with judgment, not with anger, but with understanding. The deeper I go into this energy, the more it feels like somebody standing in front of a mirror, not blaming anyone, not making excuses, just finally being honest. And that honesty is changing something inside of them, because it's becoming harder to pretend that this connection didn't matter, harder to dismiss what they felt, harder to convince themselves that walking away solved anything. In many ways, the distance seems to have done the opposite. It brought clarity, not immediately, not all at once, but slowly, piece by piece, memory by memory, realization by realization. And as these cards sit here together, I can't help but feel that this person is approaching a moment where reflection is no longer enough. Because once somebody truly understands what they've been feeling, the question eventually becomes what they're going to do about it. And honestly, that feels like the direction this energy is starting to move toward. Because somebody here is reaching a point where they can no longer keep pretending that nothing needs to change. The card that's immediately pulling my attention now is Judgment. And wow, this doesn't feel small. It doesn't feel like a passing thought. It feels like a moment that has been building for a very long time. Almost like someone is finally hearing a truth they have been trying not to hear. You know how sometimes life keeps presenting the same lesson over and over again until you're willing to face it? That's what this feels like. This person keeps arriving at the same conclusion, no matter which direction their thoughts travel. No matter how much they analyze, no matter how much they rationalize, no matter how many excuses they create. Everything seems to lead back to one realization. Something in their life is no longer working. Something they've been holding on to has become heavier than they expected. And I don't think they're able to ignore that anymore. Because this energy feels different from reflection. Reflection asks questions. Judgment begins demanding answers. And honestly, I think that's exactly what's happening inside of them. For some of you, this may involve another person. For others, it could be a situation, a lifestyle, a pattern, a belief. Whatever it is, I feel like they're beginning to recognize the role it has played in keeping them stuck. The role it has played in keeping them disconnected from what their heart truly wants. And that realization isn't comfortable. Because once you see something clearly, it's difficult to pretend you don't see it. Okay, now Seven of Wands is showing up. I have to be honest, this card feels surprisingly emotional. Not because of what's happening on the outside, but because of what's happening internally. It's like somebody is finally starting to push back. Not against you, against fear, against doubt, against outside influences, against voices that never truly represented their own. I keep feeling this image of somebody standing alone after listening to everyone else's opinions for far too long. Family, friends, people from the past, people who believed they knew what was best. People who always had something to say. And now this person is beginning to ask themselves, okay, but what do I want? And honestly, that question seems to be changing everything. Because when they answer it truthfully, the answer feels very different from the path they've been following. The deeper I go into this energy, the more I feel resistance. Not from them, from whatever has been keeping them trapped. It's almost like there's an old version of their life trying to pull them back. Old habits, old attachments, old fears, old obligations. Things that once felt familiar. things that once felt safe. But familiarity and happiness aren't always the same thing. And I think they're beginning to understand that. Now the Three of Swords appears, and suddenly the atmosphere shifts again. Because there is grief here. Real grief. Not only over what happened, but over what could have been, what should have been, what never had the chance to fully unfold. I don't feel like this person is only grieving a connection. I feel like they're grieving parts of themselves, versions of themselves that stayed silent when they wanted to speak, versions of themselves that settled when they wanted more, versions of themselves that chose comfort over truth. And that's a painful realization. Because healing isn't always about moving away from pain. Sometimes it's about admitting where the pain came from in the first place. Honestly, I think this person has spent a long time blaming circumstances, blaming timing, blaming other people, blaming everything except the one thing they're finally looking at now, their own fear. And that isn't easy, but it feels necessary. Because once they stop running from that truth, everything starts looking different. Even the memories look different. Even the choices look different. Even the future starts looking different. And that's when the world reversed catches my attention. Okay, this is interesting. Because I don't feel closure here. Not yet. In fact, I feel the opposite. I feel unfinished business. Something that refuses to stay in the past. Something that keeps resurfacing because it hasn't been fully resolved. This person may have tried convincing themselves that a chapter was over, that enough time had passed, that the story had ended. But every road they take somehow circles back to the same place, back to the same questions, back to the same feelings, back to the same connection. It's almost frustrating for them at times, because part of them wanted certainty, part of them wanted a clean ending, something simple, something final. But emotions rarely work that way, especially when they remain unspoken, especially when they continue living beneath the surface. The more I sit with this energy, the more it feels like somebody standing between two worlds. One world is familiar, predictable, safe. The other feels uncertain, emotional, risky, but also alive. And I think that's what they're beginning to notice. One path keeps repeating itself. The other offers the possibility of something different, something real, something they haven't been able to stop thinking about. And honestly, the old cycle doesn't seem to have the same hold on them anymore. Not the way it once did. Something is weakening. Something is breaking apart, slowly, quietly, but undeniably. Because this person isn't only questioning what they've been holding on to, they're beginning to question why they held on to it for so long. And that question feels incredibly important. Because once somebody starts asking that, the next step often becomes much harder to avoid. And looking at these cards together, I can't help but feel like they're getting closer to making a decision that could change the entire direction of this story. Because there comes a point where silence becomes heavier than the truth. And that's exactly where this energy seems to be leading. The moment the Ace of Cups appeared, everything softened. Not in a dramatic way, not in a sudden way. More like somebody finally lowering a wall they've been holding up for far too long. I keep feeling this deep emotional release around them, almost like they're exhausted from carrying everything alone. You know when a person spends so much time trying to stay composed that eventually they become tired of pretending they're unaffected? That's what this feels like. They're beginning to realize that no amount of control has made these feelings disappear. No amount of distance erased them. No amount of overthinking solved them. If anything, it only made them stronger. And I think that's becoming impossible for them to ignore. Because this isn't only about attraction anymore. It feels more vulnerable than that, much more personal. The kind of feeling that reaches places words struggle to explain. The kind of feeling that follows you into quiet moments. The kind of feeling that keeps showing up when nobody else is around. And as I'm looking at this Ace of Cups, I keep hearing an apology. Not necessarily a rehearsed apology, not something perfect, not something polished, just something real, something from the heart. Because I think this person knows there were things they should have said, things they should have acknowledged, moments where they could have been more honest. And that awareness seems to be growing stronger every day. Okay, now the Knight of Cups is stepping forward. This is interesting because the energy is beginning to move. For a long time, everything felt internal. Thoughts, reflection, questions, processing. But this card feels different. This feels like somebody imagining a conversation, replaying possible outcomes, thinking about what they would say if they had the chance, thinking about how they would explain everything. I almost see them sitting alone somewhere, driving, lying awake, staring out a window, going through different versions of the same conversation. One moment they're confident, the next moment they're nervous. One moment they're ready, the next moment they're questioning everything. But the important thing here is that they're imagining it at all. Because there was a period where they weren't even allowing themselves to go there emotionally. Now it feels like the possibility is becoming real inside their mind. And that's a huge shift. The deeper I go into this energy, the more I feel them wanting to bridge a gap. Not force anything, not control anything. Simply reach across the distance that has existed between the two of you. There's something very sincere about it. Something that feels much less focused on outcomes and much more focused on honesty. And honestly, okay, maybe not honestly because we're trying to use that word less today. Let's say it this way. The feeling I keep getting is that they are tired of carrying unfinished sentences in their heart. Words they never spoke, feelings they never shared, questions they never asked. At some point, all of that starts asking to be released. And now the Eight of Wands appears. Wow. The energy speeds up immediately. It's almost like something shifts internally, and suddenly standing still becomes difficult. I keep hearing the phrase, I need to say something. Not tomorrow, not someday, not eventually, just, I need to say something. Because once a person reaches a certain level of clarity, remaining silent can feel impossible. And what fascinates me is that this doesn't feel impulsive. It feels overdue. Like somebody has spent so much time thinking that they're approaching the limit of what thinking alone can accomplish. There are moments where I feel them picking up their phone, typing something, deleting it, starting over, looking at your name, looking away, coming back again, trying to find the right words. Because what they're feeling feels bigger than a casual conversation. This matters to them, more than they may openly admit, and that makes them nervous. You know, when something truly matters, people often become more careful, not less. Because they don't want to get it wrong. And that's exactly what I feel here. Carefulness, vulnerability, hope mixed with uncertainty. Now the Two of Cups is sitting right beside everything else, and the atmosphere changes again. Not because all the questions disappear, not because every obstacle suddenly vanishes, but because underneath all the confusion, there seems to be a very simple truth. The connection still exists. The emotional bond still exists. The feeling that brought the two of you into each other's lives still exists. Maybe it changed shape. Maybe it evolved. Maybe it went through periods of silence, but it never completely disappeared. And I think that's what this person is beginning to understand. There is something beautiful about realizing you've been fighting against your own heart. Not beautiful because it's easy. Beautiful because it finally allows you to stop fighting. And that's the energy I'm seeing now. Less resistance, less denial, less running, more acceptance, more truth, more willingness to acknowledge what has always been there beneath the surface. The interesting thing is that I don't feel like they've said everything yet. Not even close. In fact, it almost feels like they're standing at the edge of a conversation that could become much bigger than they originally intended. Because once the first truth is spoken, other truths often follow. And looking at these cards together, I can't shake the feeling that what begins as a simple confession may eventually lead to a much larger decision than either of you expects. Because once the truth is finally spoken, something changes. Not necessarily in the outer world first. Inside. The weight starts to shift. The fear starts to loosen its grip. The endless questioning starts to quiet down. And that's exactly where this energy is taking me now. The first card appearing is the Fool. Okay, this feels important. Because for the first time in a long time, I don't feel this person looking backward trying to understand the past. I feel them looking ahead. Not with complete certainty, not with all the answers, but with curiosity. And that alone feels like progress. You know, there are moments in life when somebody realizes they've spent so much time protecting themselves that they accidentally blocked out the very thing they wanted. That's the feeling surrounding this card. It's like they're standing at the edge of a new chapter, realizing that staying exactly where they are no longer feels comfortable. The strange thing is that I don't think the future looks as frightening to them as it once did. In fact, the future feels lighter, almost hopeful, because they're beginning to understand that moving forward doesn't require perfection. It only requires honesty. And I keep hearing this thought inside their energy. What if I stopped assuming the worst? Because so much of their journey seems connected to expectations. Expecting disappointment, expecting rejection, expecting things to fall apart, expecting history to repeat itself. But something is changing. They're starting to question whether those expectations were ever truly serving them. And the moment that thought appears, everything begins opening up. Now the star is shining through the reading. Wow. The atmosphere becomes softer immediately. There is something very healing happening here. Not because all the wounds disappear overnight, but because they're finally allowing themselves to believe that something better is possible. For a long time, I feel like this person was looking at life through the lens of old pain. Every decision, every relationship, every emotional risk, everything filtered through experiences that taught them to stay guarded, to stay careful, to stay protected. But the star feels different. It feels like somebody looking up after spending years staring at the ground and realizing there is still beauty ahead of them. There is still possibility. There is still something worth believing in. And oddly enough, I think you became part of that realization, not because you rescued them, not because you fixed them, but because your presence challenged a story they had been telling themselves for a very long time. A story that said genuine connections weren't real. A story that said people always leave. A story that said vulnerability only leads to pain. The deeper I sit with this energy, the more I feel them recognizing that you represented something they weren't prepared for, something authentic, something that couldn't easily fit into the old patterns they were used to. And because of that, it changed them, more than they realized at the time. Now Temperance appears, and this card feels beautiful here, because everything suddenly slows down. The rush, the anxiety, the internal chaos. It's almost like somebody is finally finding their balance again. I don't feel extremes anymore. I don't feel somebody running away from their emotions. I don't feel somebody desperately trying to suppress what they feel. Instead, I see somebody learning how to sit with their feelings, accept them, understand them, work with them. There is maturity here, growth, patience. The kind of growth that happens quietly. The kind nobody applauds because it takes place behind closed doors. And yet it changes everything. Because this person is beginning to realize they don't need to choose between logic and emotion. They don't need to choose between safety and love. Those things can coexist. For some reason, I keep seeing them becoming calmer about the connection. Not because they care less, quite the opposite, because they finally understand it better. And understanding often removes fear. The more they accept their feelings, the less those feelings control them. The less they fight themselves, the less they fight the connection. And then, the Empress arrives. And wow, the energy shifts again. This feels like appreciation, deep appreciation, the kind that develops when somebody finally sees clearly. I feel this person looking at you differently now, not through the lens of uncertainty, not through the lens of suspicion, but through the lens of value. They're beginning to recognize everything you brought into their life, the comfort, the warmth, the stability, the understanding, the way you made space for them without demanding they become someone else. And I think that's becoming impossible for them to overlook. Because when somebody starts seeing value clearly, they naturally start asking different questions. Instead of asking what could go wrong, they start asking what could grow. Instead of focusing on what they might lose, they begin focusing on what they could build. And that's where this reading becomes incredibly interesting, because I don't feel this person dreaming about temporary moments anymore. I feel them imagining something sustainable, something meaningful, something that has roots. There is a growing desire to create rather than escape, to nurture rather than avoid, to participate rather than observe from a distance. And that's a very different energy than where this story began. The old illusions seem weaker now. The old fears don't feel as convincing. The old attachments appear to be losing their influence. Because the closer this person gets to their own truth, the harder it becomes to settle for anything that doesn't align with it. And as these cards settle on the table, I can't help but feel like they're approaching a moment where possibility becomes reality. A moment where thoughts begin turning into choices, and choices begin turning into action. Because there is still one final step standing between realization and movement, and it feels much closer than they may realize. The energy feels unfinished in the best possible way, like a story that still has a few pages left to write. So if this reading resonated with you, trust your intuition, take care of your heart, and allow things to unfold one step at a time. Thank you for being here and sharing this moment with me. Thank you for your kindness, your support, and your beautiful energy. I never take it for granted. You guys are amazing. Have a beautiful day wherever you are, and I'll see you in the next reading. Take care. Bye-bye.